Good evening, everyone. Welcome to DIA. My name is Matilde Guidagli. I'm a curator here and the organizer of the Artist on Artist lecture series, where since 2001 we invite an artist to reflect upon the work of another artist in DIA's collection and past program. And I am very pleased to introduce tonight's event featuring Alan Michelson on Robert Smithson. But before diving in, I wish to thank everyone who helped make tonight's event possible, and in particular, Lisa Lefebvre at the Holt Smithson Foundation, Carl McCool at EAI, as well as Max, Ella, Kim, and the visitor service team at DIA. In 1970, Robert Smithson realized Spiral Jetty, an outdoor sculpture sited on the shores of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. The work has been under DIA stewardship since 1999, when Nancy Holt arranged for its donation. For the past decade, a group of Smithson's indoor sculptures from the late 60s, employing glass, mirrors, gravel, and salt crystals, has been on long-term view at DIA Beacon. Based in New York and a Mohawk member of the Six Nations of the Grand River, Alan Michelson is an artist, writer, curator, and co-founder, among others, of the Indigenous New York series with the Veralist Center for Altered Politics at the New School. His visual artwork of 3 decades rethinks the notion of site specificity, which is central to Smithson and many DIA artists, with what could be defined site-informed art. Grounded in the retrieval of local histories, Alan's method foregrounds indigenous models of political, social, and environmental relationships to challenge historical amnesia and often denial. Alan's work has been exhibited internationally and in New York over the past few years. You might have encountered it at PS1 in the context of Greater New York, where Alan realized Midden, a bed of cured oyster shells overlaid with a video projection of the Long Island and Brooklyn shorelines, as well as with traditional singing from the Delaware tribe. And at the Whitney, where he was the subject of the sole exhibition Wolf Nation, including, among others, a work that deployed augmented reality to reinstate the Napi tobacco fields in the lobby of the museum. Alan's work is currently on view at the Thomas Cole Historic Site, upstate New York, until December, if you have not had a chance to see it yet. And his public sculpture commission with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, titled The Knowledge Keepers, opens next month. Being in conversation with Alan for the past year leading to tonight was a sincere pleasure. And so, without further ado, please join me welcoming Alan Michelson on Robert Smithson.
Thank you, Matilde. And thank you, DIA, for inviting me to present this talk. As some of you may know, this lecture is called The Shell Without the Ocean. The title and epigraph are both from Robert Smithson's 1971 essay, Art and Dialectics, and reads, "Art critics and artists have for a long time considered the shell without the context of the ocean. Robert Smithson is an artist who occupies an important and yet increasingly complicated place in the canon, including my personal one. The compelling art of this original and unconventional artist, and that of the early land artists, reflects social conventions and entitlements of their day that many now find objectionable, particularly indigenous communities. As an indigenous artist, in high school and college during their emergence in the late 60s and early 70s, who believes art has a role to play not only in the aesthetic realm, but also in the ethical and political realms, I will try to balance appreciation with critique. I'm currently having a show, as Matilde mentioned, at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site in Catskill, arguably the birthplace of American landscape art, if not of American painting. And in putting together this presentation, I noticed the surprising resemblance between 2 masterpieces of land art, Thomas Cole's View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm, the Oxbow, 1836, and Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, 1970. It so happens that as a child, I lived 7 miles from the Oxbow and only a couple of miles from the site of the first dinosaur tracks in recorded history, and the roadside landmark known as the Dinosaur. And the driveway to the museum where I took my first art lessons, the former Wisteria Hearst Estate, was paved with slabs containing fossilized dinosaur footprints removed from the same site. This is Robert there at about age 10 and some tracks. More than mere transcriptions of what my grandmother used to call scenery, landscape paintings, like the landscapes they represent, are cultural, as much a product of conception as perception, of invention as convention. Cole was the painter most sensitive to the profound split at the core of American attitudes toward land, and the most able, despite humble beginnings as an itinerant self-taught painter, to express them, as he does in the Oxbow. My friend, painter Adam Svianovich, has described Cole's work as, quote, a fascinating and curiously American hybrid of observational realism, romantic interpretation, ethical narrative, Christian allegory, nostalgic sentimentality, and futurist fantasy, some of which could also apply to Smithson. The dialectical tension in the Oxbow between placid river valley bathed in golden light and dark, turbulent, wooded mountain embodies the conflict between the pastoral and the sublime, contrasting modalities and even temporalities spatially juxtaposed in the painting. This tension is present not only in American landscape painting, but in the culture at large. In Fenimore Cooper and Henry Thoreau, Francis Parkman and Frederick Jackson Turner, Buffalo Bill's Wild West, and the, quote, world expositions and fairs of the 19th and 20th centuries. In John Ford movies, Homestead and national parks, Disneyland, historical sites, markers and monuments, tourist attractions, architecture, landscape architecture, video games, and of course in land art, including Robert Smithson's. If you believe, as I do, that the story of America is the story of the land, then landscape art, including land art, is its visual corollary. My recent talk on Thoreau sparked a lot of rereading on my part, not only of his luminous nature writing and influential civil disobedience essay, which I printed onto this model of his Walden cabin, part of my Prophetstown installation upstate, but also of writing about him and his work. As with Thomas Cole, unexpected parallels with Robert Smithson arose in the process. Noted figures of their respective centuries, both were contrarian provocateurs, prolific in their writing, field naturalists, social critics, surveyors, and communicators with an unusual ability to shift registers from the polemic to the poetic within the same piece. And both were shadowed by the early loss of their brothers, Thoreau's to tetanus when they were in their early 20s, Smithson's to childhood leukemia prior to his birth. These losses left lasting imprints, which in Smithson's case may have played a central role in his art. A fascinating thesis Suzanne Bodeger explores in her recent biography, Inside the Spiral, The Passions of Robert Smithson. I came across a quote recently which reminded me of an additional connection between the two that also personally applies, from Wallace Stegner's 1992 essay, The Sense of Place. The form of Thoreau's essays, rumination hung upon the framework of an outdoor excursion, has influenced virtually every nature writer since, from Burroughs and Muir to Wendell Berry, Edward Abbey, and Barry Lopez. And I would add Robert Smithson to the list. Perhaps it is odd to think of Smithson as a nature writer. After all, he repudiated the nascent environmental movement of his time. But his outdoor excursions to sites such as quarries, the Pine Barrens, the Meadowlands, Roselle Point, and the Yucatan, and his extended ruminations on them, both in print and in artworks, that he himself termed expeditionary art, qualify him as such and resonates with my similar attraction and excursions to certain kinds of landscapes. A prime example is his kaleidoscopic mock travelogue, Tour of the Monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, published in Art Forum in December 1967, which begins with a September bus ride from Port Authority and mention of the reading material he brought along, a copy of the New York Times and a paperback entitled Earthworks by Brian W. Aldiss, a science fiction novel about a world in catastrophic ecological crisis. Browsing through the arts section of the Times, he mentions a, quote, blurry reproduction of Allegorical Landscape by Samuel F.B. Morse, one he reproduces in the spread, indirectly linking him to the genre that includes Thomas Cole's Oxbow. Recounting his odyssey through the prosaic landscape of Passaic, he writes, along the Passaic riverbanks were many minor monuments, such as concrete abutments that supported the shoulders of a new highway in the process of being built. Since it was Saturday, many machines were not working, and this caused them to resemble prehistoric creatures trapped in mud, or better, extinct machines, mechanical dinosaurs stripped of their skin. Nearby on the riverbank was an artificial crater that contained a pale, limpid pond of water, and from the side of the crater protruded 6 large pipes that gushed the water of the pond into the river. This constituted a monumental fountain that suggested 6 horizontal smokestacks that seemed to be flooding the river with liquid smoke. Like Smithson and Thoreau, some of my works derive from and even chronicle outdoor excursions, although mainly urban ones in Lenape-Hoking, Greater New York, and take the form of artworks informed by indoors excursions, the research I do on the sites and their histories. And for the past 35 years, some of my work is focused on water and waterways. My first solo site-specific work was Earth's Eye, 1990, an outdoor sculptural installation in a lower Manhattan park on the former site of the Collect, a pond that fell victim to colonial industry. Once the locus of fresh water, fishing, and feasting by the Lenape, as evidenced by a monumental shell midden located on its western banks, now Tribeca. The deep, spring-fed pond and its marshes supported numerous species of plant and animal life, yet the pristine state of the pond did not long survive its colonial occupation. In the mid-18th century, a tannery established itself on the pond and polluted it with its tannins, followed by further polluting tanneries, breweries, and slaughterhouses. This is Collect Pond by Archibald Robertson from 1798, and that's a map of Collect Pond from 1874. By 1800, industrial waste had thoroughly poisoned the pond, and the stench of animal fat, grease, manure, and curing hides fouled the air, realities not conveyed in Robertson's rendering. Ecocide is the term now used to describe such a crime against nature, as in a murder the perpetrator sought to bury their victim. First by draining the Collect's outlet to the Hudson, transforming a creek into a fetid canal, later covered to form Canal Street, then by leveling the hill in Muncie Midden and using them as landfill. Renamed Paradise Square and slated for residential development, the land began to sink and stink as the vegetation buried in the fill rotted away. Far from paradise, the area evolved into the notorious slum called the 5 Points. If the pond was a victim whose grave was the landfill, its headstone was the equally notorious prison built on the plot in 1838, the New York Halls of Justice and House of Detention, known as the Tombs for its massive mausoleum-inspired Egyptian Revival architecture. Besides incarcerating inmates in its damp, forbidding cells, the Tombs hanged some 50 convicted murderers in its yard during its 64 years in existence. The Tombs moniker stuck to its 3 successors on or around its spot, and presumably will to its 4th. The new high-rise jail, now under construction, rising into ruin, as Smithson would say, dubbed the jail scraper by the Chinatown community who futilely opposed the project. I had access to a pond on Staten Island and started taking plaster casts of its muddy banks, capturing the tracks of a heron, but also broken glass and other trash. I later cast objects related to the Collect's history, like oyster shells, reeds, deer tracks, corn, antique ice skates, and an anchor. From these molds, I cast 40 concrete wedges and installed them in the park in the shape of the pond as a memorial, a mapping reminiscent of one of Smithson's Earth maps. Earth's Eye was my first piece that attempted to mark and represent an unthinkable absence. that of an indigenous pond and the life it sustained for millennia, destroyed and erased. Invited to create a Queens-focused work for a Queens Museum exhibition in 2001, I decided to explore the Queens shoreline of Newtown Creek, the stream dividing the borough from Brooklyn. Sailing up it in a boat, I shot video of its entire 3.5-mile shoreline to create a latter-day moving panorama, which I later projected onto a large 11-foot by 14-foot screen I sewed of white turkey feathers and commissioned a soundtrack from composer Michael Schumacher to accompany it. The title of the resulting work, Messpot, meaning at the bad water place, is the indigenous name of the area and probably refers to its brackishness. In retrospect, the name seems prophetic, as the creek may now be the most polluted waterway in the world. Like the Collect, its teeming waters and marshes were sacrificed to industry. After the Civil War, the first modern oil refineries located on its banks, along with other polluting factories whose waste destroyed the creek and its freshwater tributaries. A multi-million-gallon underground oil spill has leaked into the creek and surrounding soil for decades, and the EPA designated the creek a Superfund site in 2010. Just going to play a brief quick clip of it. Mine was an exploration in reverse, an indigenous inventory of Messpot centuries after its violent seizure by the settlers of Queens. The idea to project on white feathers stemmed from a dream I had of a white bird, which later materialized in the form of a great egret I surprised while scouting the creek and which appears in the video. Its presence in such a desperate environment signaled the incredible persistence of indigenous life, including the fish and crabs which were its diet, and its potential for regeneration. This is Robert Smithson's non-site on the left, Site Uncertain from 1968, and Chalk and Mirror Displacement from 1969. Robert Smithson's strikingly elegant, surprising combinations of natural materials placed in coffin-like bins or piled on or supporting flat planes like mirrors have been an important influence, both formally and conceptually, as they derive from his site-non-site dialectic. He described it thus at the White Museum's Earth Art Symposium in 1969. The site, in a sense, is the physical raw reality, the earth or the ground that we are not really aware of when we are in an interior room. And so I decided that I would set limits in terms of this dialogue. Instead of putting something on the landscape, I decided it would be interesting to transfer the land indoors to the non-site, which is an abstract container. His non-site, the abstract representation of the outdoor site indoors, is a presence, yet one perpetually connoting the absence of the site and its containment. A material presence, but one like Cole's Mountain, connoting a conceptual one. This is even more complicated when you consider landscape from an indigenous perspective. Collect Pond and Newtown Creek are ancient, once pristine indigenous sites literally buried under industrial fill and sludge. Sites absent twice over. Their physical raw realities have been exploited, abused, and erased due to a lack of awareness of their deeper value. Displacements on the grandest scale imaginable. Smithson and the land artists were urban-based gallery artists bored with the legacy of abstract expressionism and its formalist constraints, and with the hegemony of paint on canvas, however applied. who sought to free themselves by turning to sculpture, site, and eventually earthworks by mining the form of ancient, large-scale indigenous earthen mounds. Modernist artists' mining of indigenous tribal art was already an established entitlement at that point, starting with Picasso and African art and continuing up through Pollock and Navajo sand painting. Minimalism and conceptualism, though dull and constrictive in their own ways, sparked the artists of Smithson's generation to bold experimentation with sculpture, geometric form, scale, materials, and ideas within a much cooler, more cerebral register characterized by repetition, seriality, and modularity. Their experiments, some of which later came to be called post-minimalism, infiltrated and galvanized the sleepy scene, and are a well from which later artists, including I, have drawn in our own explorations of art as a vehicle of resistance, historical revision, and accountability. There is, of course, no requirement of art to be socially conscious or environmentally conscious. The only requirement of art really is beauty. But it is art whose beauty goes beyond detached aesthetics and strives for an embodied ethics that matter most to me, as the times call for it. The 50-year reign of art for art's sake, cocooned from any non-art agenda, now seems remote, an artifact of a more tractable world in which art's place was in the galleries and not on the front lines, and its proper focus was on the picture plane, not on pictures of planes dropping bombs. The land artists rejected the environmental movement partially because it was associated with the romantic notion of, quote, going back to the land. And they didn't see themselves as going back to the land, but going forward with it, however much that involved preempting an archaic indigenous form to do it. And we are now in an era in which the idea is not back to the land, but land back. The movement to return land to the sovereignty and stewardship of indigenous people. As I see it, land back represents not only a restoration of just sovereignty to the people over their land and lives, but a restoration of just sovereignty to our non-human kin over their habitats and lives. Last week, the World Wildlife Fund released a report that wildlife populations have fallen by a catastrophic 73% in the 5 decades between 1970, the year of spiral jetty, and 2020, the year of the pandemic. I'm going to play a short clip of Wolf Nation, a video I made for the Indicators Artist on Climate Change show at Storm King in 2018, which is, if you know Storm King or you know anything about the geography, is located on Munsee land. The Munsee were Wolf Clan people known as the Wolf Tribe, and we Mohawks also have a Wolf Clan, and I wanted to make a work honoring our non-human kin, who in the case of these critically endangered red wolves are barely hanging on. Colonialism not only displaced our people from our lands, it displaced our animal relatives. The panoramic format is based on wampum belts, the palette on wampum, and the soundtrack was by White Mountain Apache musician Laura Ortman. In his ultra-modern essay in Arts Magazine in 1967, Smithson writes, quote, "Today's artist tries to make his art refer to nothing, while the art of the 30s seemed to refer to everything. But of course, today and yesterday may always be reversed," end quote. That mark was prescient. Today and yesterday have been reversed, and what seems remarkable today, when art seems to refer to everything, is the strict half-century ban on reference and content in art observed by the art world after what Smithson dismisses as the plague of social realism, and its similar ban on representation, two of art's most long-standing and powerful potentials. Smithson is relational, but in an odd way, alive to crystalline structure and inorganic physical processes, but dead to socio-political ones. Smithson's writing is a deep archive of dystopian ideas and musings around land, art, time, material, and oblivion, some of which resonate and some of which rankle. In The Establishment, 1968, he writes, quote, organizations seem to grow more and more crackpot with all their activist demonstrations. He refers to, quote, bogus movements and fake ideals, and closes with, the establishment is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. That last statement is based on a quote from James Joyce's Ulysses, a line spoken by his character Stephen Dedalus. History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. It's a familiar quotation from the novel, yet one that bears more analysis. Is a nightmare something from which we can try to awaken, or is it rather one that wakes us up? If history is a nightmare that can wake us up, then it can also transform us by confronting us with its stark truths. Smithson was a complicated, hard-eyed poet of absence and loss, who drew attention to broken landscapes by rehabilitating them aesthetically. And while loss and absence are themes in my work, I locate their sources elsewhere, in people with agency. In sociopolitical processes and policies, not in impersonal geologic processes of inevitable decline. It wasn't entropy that destroyed Collect Pond. It was the extractive mindset of the people who owned it. As David Graeber and David Wengrow write in The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, 2021, quote, in Roman law, there are three basic rights relating to possession. Usus, the right to use, fructus, the right to enjoy the products of a property, for instance, the fruit of a tree, and abusus, the right to damage or destroy. Asked by Dennis Wheeler in their 1970 conversation, what's the strongest predeterminant in where you establish the site? Smithson answers, I'm looking for a homogeneous material that, in a sense, covers the vicinity. Since his aim in this was to collect, transport, and transform that material for purchase, isn't that a form of extraction? And in a refutation of historical humanism from 1966, he writes, quote, the artist should declare his art apart from the self-involving traps of innocence and guilt, and resist all forms of humanism. And this declaration should be repeated ad infinitum. Among other things, video allows me to center land in my work without disturbing it further. And there is a disturbing kind of literalism and superficiality to the land artists' embrace of land as medium. Their projects were on the land, but not really of it. For all their digging and excavation, their cuts and borings into the earth wounds, the relationship of the land artist to the land wasn't very deep. Their projects bear an unfortunate relation to America's real land art, which was the art with which it acquired some 3 billion square miles of Turtle Island. About 25 years ago, I was in a show at Antioch College in Ohio and visited and walked the massive mound complex known as the Newark Earthworks, including those that were then part of Mound Builders Country Club. Here's a short clip with drone footage of the complex.
This is the Octagon Earthworks, one of the grandest remnants of the once monumental Newark Earthworks that originally spanned more than 4.5 square miles and included 7 million cubic feet of earth. The Octagon Earthworks were preserved by the citizens of Licking County, who raised their taxes to purchase the property so that it could be used as the state encampment grounds for the National Guard. Later, when the National Guard left the site, Mound Builders Country Club took over, leasing the site from the Newark Board of Trade. That relationship continued until the 1930s, when the Ohio History Connection took ownership of the site and continued that relationship with the country club. Many people think Ohio's Indian mounds are piles of dirt. And that's true on one level, but the Hopewell culture were masters of soil science. They knew the properties of different kinds of soils and selected only those that would preserve, that would maintain the integrity of mounds for thousands of years. The question of why the Hopewell culture constructed these ancient monuments is fundamentally unanswerable on one level, but Certainly, like with similar structures all over the world, there must have been a religious motivation at its heart. The octagon earthworks is aligned to the rising and setting of the moon over an 18.6-year-long cycle. That linkage of this earthen architecture with the rhythms of the cosmos is one of the things that suggests a ceremonial religious purpose. The octagon earthworks is one part of a serial nomination of several Hopewell earthwork sites that we've called the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks, and we're hoping soon to be nominating that site, that set of sites, to the UNESCO World Heritage List. UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and they recognize the most important cultural sites in the world. The Great Pyramid of Egypt is on the list, the Great Wall of China. Natural sites like the Grand Canyon are on the list as well. Stonehenge is on this list. Just these iconic ancient sites, and we think the Newark earthworks and the other earthworks that make this nomination deserve to be on that site because of their enormous scale, because of the incredible knowledge of geometry and astronomy that's built into the earthworks, and the somewhat mysterious fact that this monumental architecture here in the Hopewell region was built without a king or a pharaoh ordering people to do this. It was built by a number of dispersed communities, not people living in a great city, to come together for this religious purpose, to build this monumental architecture, and to some extent that's unprecedented in the world. So that's one of the things we think that make these sites World Heritage List worthy.
In 2012, I was selected for a commission for a permanent monument honoring Virginia's Native nations. And in my research for it, turned up this object from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford called Powhatan's Mantle. It consists of 4 deer hides sewn together and decorated with figures and about 30 circles of white snail shell embroidery. The circles may represent a map of the subtribes of the Powhatan Confederacy, and the shells are sewn in spirals, which gave me the idea of making the spiral the form of the monument. Its site was a gentle slope on the grounds of the Virginia State House in Richmond, the same one designed by Thomas Jefferson. And my idea was to indigenize the plot by making an earthwork in which a spiral would be sort of stitched into the land through a cut and fill process that would produce a path paved with an aggregate containing local river stones, bordered by a low indigenous stone wall, which would double as a few hundred feet of continuous seating, and would be bordered by a selection of indigenous plants, leading to a circular drum-shaped water feature inscribed with the names of waterways, synonymous with indigenous tribal names, positioned according to their geography. My goal was a place of indigenous hosting, not the other way around. Of course, I was aware of Spiral Jetty, but I was basing Mantle on prior indigenous sources, including the great earthworks of America, the mounds and middens of the eastern woodland people. It's being used by the tribes today, and this earlier in the year, this is a gathering called the Spotswood Treaty Tribute, where some of the nations give the governor, it's presented there, 3 peace arrows wrapped in a beaver pelt and wampum belt. For MoMA PS1, I think I should say this is Robert Smithson's Mirror and Crushed Shells on the left, 1969, and also from 1969, The Hypothetical Continent and Shells. For MoMA's PS1's Greater New York 2021 exhibition, I sailed local waterways that were once some of the richest oyster grounds in the world, shot panoramic footage of their shorelines, and projected it onto a 30-foot-long midden crafted of oyster shells borrowed from the Billion Oyster Project. Indigenous shell middens like the one at Collect Pond once dotted the landscape up and down the East Coast until extracted for shoreline development. Much more than mere trash piles, some contained burials and others were ceremonial structures. They are and were testament not only to the natural bounty of the area, but to the sound ecological practices of indigenous communities over millennia. A midden unearthed in Dobbs Ferry in 1998 was dated to 6950 BC. Middens and mounds, again, of the eastern woodlands are the great earthworks of America. In contrast, land art, like colonization, was a sort of jailbreak culminating in a land grab. For land-hungry colonists from the confines of the mother country, for the early land artists from the confines of the gallery and studio. In both cases, the acts of liberation and appropriation rested on a foundation of false entitlement to indigenous land. Like the colonists who preceded them, the land artists expanded and projected onto land without prior right or reference. To both, Turtle Island was terra nullius, no one's land, an empty plot, or an open-air studio, which it is not. Like settlers, the artists were drawn to land whose physical properties suited their purposes, to farm or to mine or to site colossal sculpture. Compared with indigenous mounds, communally constructed earthen forms grounded in place knowledge and attuned to cosmic cycles, land art with its conceits seems insubstantial despite its massive scale. Its obvious but mostly unacknowledged debt to indigenous earthworks remains outstanding to this day. Created at a time, the 60s and early 70s, of political upheaval and protest, its stance is surprisingly apolitical and ahistorical. Compelling as it is, land art elides the violent human history which empowered its artists to manipulate the land in that manner. Art with sight, absent memory. Clashing understandings of what land is and how it should be treated and who people are and how they should be treated is at the root of many of our present problems, political, social, economic, and environmental, which all seem to be converging in a series of bruising disasters like the latest hurricane battering an already battered shore. The understanding of land as thing, as asset, as an inanimate resource to divide, own, and exploit, to explore and claim with violence or manipulation, is part of what was carried over here on those ships, as is the understanding of people as belonging to racial hierarchies determining their entitlement to certain rights and privileges or their exclusion from the same. The most dangerous cargo on those countless ships was invisible, was these doctrines that the people had absorbed and organized themselves around, cargo even more deadly than the equally invisible microbes, a virus they carried over. The gap between their worldview and the indigenous one operating here for millennia has been sharp and wide, with disastrous effects on the land and all the life it sustains, both human and non-human. It is the gap between assessing land as dead or alive, inanimate or animate, thing or relation, something to exploit or to steward. And it is also the gap between assessing other human beings along similar lines. Since understandings inform perception, human sight is not only a psychological but a cultural act, so that what one person sees when looking at a tree, for example, can be radically different from what another person sees. Oops, I think I meant to show, it's okay, we're just gonna go on. I think I'm time-wise, I don't need to, time-wise, we're maybe, how are we doing time-wise? Good? Should I show a little bit, can I show a bit of, I'm gonna go back and this is, hope it'll work. So this is Midden, the piece that I did at PS1 in 2021. And I'm not sure if this is, yeah. This is a close-up view of it, just a few seconds. And it was shown in that double height gallery, so you could see it from different perspectives, but this is what it looked like close up. There's a way in which you project onto an object, and the object and the video exchange qualities. So in this case, the video sort of hardens and the shells sort of melt. Anyways. I was saying about trees. So on the left is the first of Smithson's upside-down trees, done in Alfred, New York in 1969. And on the right is a photograph by Andre Strong Bearhart Gaines of a scarlet oak. Recent photograph. Art historical, I'm going to read a little bit of art historical interpretation of Smithson's work that's from the Dia site. Art historical interpretation of Smithson's upside-down trees as arbores inversa has tended to focus on long-standing deployments of this rhetorical figure to manifest topsy-turvy social conditions. In Smithson's case, the multiple upheavals of the 1960s. A.B. Chambers has documented the alternate meanings attaching to the upside-down tree in classical tradition, including Plato's schematization of the soul. In the Timaeus, a work cited by Smithson's Yucatan essay that also discusses Atlantis, the philosopher likens the human body, quote, to a plant whose roots are not in the earth but in the heavens. And then I'm going to read from a text about Andre, published by the Native Land Conservancy, an indigenous-led land conservation nonprofit. Andre Strong Bearhart Gaines is not formally educated as a botanist, but what he knows about the natural plants that grow in the woodlands of Nipmuc territory in the middle of Massachusetts is sophisticated. Sophisticated traditional ecological knowledge that he employs to keep his heritage alive. He has spent years mapping forests and swamps of the Douglas State Forest, taking photos and making cultural inventory reports of plants, critical traditional food, and medicine. Andre is a vocal activist for tribal concerns and serves as a cultural steward of the tribe. Indigenous peoples need to be part of the forest management planning in our traditional homelands, he said. There's always a missing link to the relationship of the land for these organizations, unlike for indigenous peoples' connections. Their relationship doesn't allow them to see a dying forest like it's their kin. It occurred to me that between Smithson and Andre, with whom I'm collaborating on the Knowledge Keepers, and their projects, there is both overlap and tension. The unexpected inversion of Smithson's tree in the photograph hits you in the guts in a way that only powerful art can, whereas Andre's more familiar photograph of the scarlet oak was shot from a very different perspective and carries a very different charge. The overlap and tension is in their response to trees and to mapping, and as we will see, to swamps. So in closing, I'm going to screen two videos. First, Nancy Holt's Swamp from 1969, and then right after it, Andre Strong Bearhart Gaines's No Loose Braids, Land Stewardship and Reciprocity 2023.
You know, when I come into these cedar swamps, I instantly feel humbled. I feel really small. That air that we're breathing, the energy, there's a medicine here. It's these cedars that bring me back into balance, and it's these cedars that I know my spirit's telling me to fight for. So this is a letter from DCR. Dear Andre, thank you for your approach in DCR staff about your desire to continue Nipmuc traditional cultural practices as part of your continuing relationship to the cedar swamps in the homelands. Douglas Cedar Swamp needs a restoration plan in order to create an environment that will sustain and foster growth of cedar trees. Your request to remove dead cedar is a first step to help and facilitate the regeneration of the cedar grove and will serve as a catalyst for developing a long-term plan. This was basically written with the thought process that we are supposed to volunteer our time as Nipmuc folks to come and help teach DCR how to properly do their job that they've been getting paid for X amount of years. Watch your step. This moss is very much alive. Today is a day that we're able to harvest some of the dead cedar out of this forest here. Got it? This cedar swamp is at a major state of decline. Half this forest is dead, standing or laying on the ground, choking. We're going to utilize a lot of this dead to build a traditional home site. No matter how big this is and how much cedar's here, there's actually none young enough to be able to build our traditional home.
Yeah.
I think it was the late 90s or mid 90s, Hurricane Bob. That's what came in, and if you look across, you can see that these are blowdown. This is from that hurricane. So we think from then, it hasn't been stewarded properly. If they had alleviated a lot of the dead after that hurricane, opened up some canopies, I can only imagine what this would be. It'd be healthy. We don't understand why DCR, the state, are stating that they're stewarding these spaces and places. But take a look at what they look like. Completely swamped down. Floor is almost covered. The canopy is completely closed. You need to let some sunlight in, and you gotta remove some from the ground so that these cedar can grow again. Some of our biggest challenges are from rules, regulations, bureaucracy. At first, we couldn't get here, Douglas State Forest. They were gatekeeping, essentially. We got to a point where we wanted to start cutting the gates down. But after some years of going back and forth, in a good way, they then saw that there was health happening because of these works that we're doing. Since creating this film, the state has created one job opportunity for Indigenous coordination and stewardship as a liaison from tribe to state. It looks like they've now have Indigenous stewardship, but one person cannot possibly steward 450,000 acres, along with even DCR. There's many ways that the state could do the right thing, as in uplift Indigenous organizations who are already doing this work. We need partnership and true allyship. All I see is that we have so much more work to do. And so I get discouraged, but I also just look back and see how much work that we've done already, and I can see that the future is hopeful. Oh yeah, look at how big that one got. That makes me really happy to see. Those braids stands for activism, standing up for Indigenous rights. As a Nipmuc person, we have every right when it comes to hunting, fishing, and gathering. Some of these things slowed down our cultural practices, but they never stopped. And so we're here to revitalize that in a really strong way. The Executive Order 126 clearly states that our hunting, fishing, and gathering rights have never changed. We don't need permission from DCR or from the state to gather these poles in the ways that we need to.
Was Smithson's film in the Meadowlands?
Say it again.
Was it in the Meadowlands?
Swamp?
Yeah, Swamp was in the Meadowlands. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as an additional thing, what structure were they going to build for the cedar poles? They're way-tos, basically wigwams. But they're not springy, they're not young enough and springy enough to be bent the way they want it. So they do, what they can.
Yes.
So thanks, Michael. That was great. I'm wondering if you chose to talk about Robert Smithson, and in the course of doing the research for the talk, your opinion of him changed or deepened, or or something else?
I think it deepened. You know, I hadn't read as much. You know, I was familiar with his work. I've always liked his work. And this is not a screed against it, you know. It's more like trying to maybe measure the gap between where we are now with land and understandings about land and where they were. And it also occurred to me, having lived through that period and been out in those demonstrations that actually worked, you know, we were out there and the Vietnam War was stopped. And people rioted after Martin Luther King's assassination and the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed. There were things that worked then that don't work now, or don't seem to work. And I think that a lot of politics and activism has sort of collapsed into art. So, and I think, you know, maybe that's unfortunate or something, but I think it's necessary right now. So it's just, you know, a different time.
Are you working on any upcoming land art pieces?
You know, I'm thinking about something. Yeah, actually something that's coming up in 2026. Yeah, but it's not. It's nothing. It's just the thought.
Thank you. Are there certain considerations that you think about when choosing materials for work that you're doing, and I guess, do you ever, like with the shells that you had shown, did you borrow those and then return them?
Yes. Yes, if you know anything about the Billion Oyster Project, they're this small nonprofit that are based on Governor's Island, and their project involves recycling. They make weekly runs to area restaurants and collect their used oyster shells. And then they cure them out in piles, middens really, out in Governor's Island. And when they're cured, they sort of bale them and then strategically build oyster reefs. You know, oysters need hard surfaces to cling to. And they say that one oyster can clean up to 50 gallons of water a day. So their goal is to put 1 billion oysters. They're also hatching oyster spat out in Brooklyn. So it was a privilege to partner with them on that. And yeah, it was like that. We returned the shells. It was actually shown, a version of it was shown at the Gwangju Biennale last year, and I partnered with a cooperative there who lent the shells. A little different, but in that same way. But you know, your question, to answer the first part of your question, context is everything for me. And so the research that I do sort of leads me to something, sometimes a material that seems right. Like when I did that first piece for the Public Art Fund, the Earth's Eye, you know, I was seeing all these, you know, municipal sorts of statues and so much concrete down there. So it was cast concrete. But it started out just these little sketches, little plaster casts that I was taking of a pond that was alive. And so it really varies. And then video has been a good thing for me because, again, maybe partially inspired. It's hard to trace actual influence, you know, because you get it from so much, it's so porous. But I think Smithson's combinations of materials and sort of man-made materials with natural ones are just amazing looking. And yeah, I think they've influenced a lot of people.
This may be more of an observation, Alan, but in thinking about your work, and one of your formal strategies, regardless of the material, is really kind of overlap and overlaying. And the talk really had that structure very much so, especially in this last pairing of swamp and kind of a different approach to swamp. And of course, there is no ambition for this to be an artwork. The other one is an artwork. So. And you often work breaking those categories. There's no ambition for the oysters to be art, but then you're overlaying video, and as you said, there's this kind of transformation that happens. But you had a pairing which, just prior to the swamps, with the upside down tree. And for the first time, through the cumulative effect of your lecture, for the first time I looked at that as transgression, which is something that never occurred to me for Smithson. But yeah, I was wondering whether transgression as some kind of of a law is something that you see in that gesture. And then comparing maybe to what we see instead in Andre's video, where we have the American flag upside down with a chief upside down as well. And yeah, I guess not really a question, but
No, those are good observations. I mean, obviously, it is sort of apples and oranges, but it's about the same orange, right? It's and very different views.
But that's something that you bring together in your work a lot.
Well, Smithson had, it's very convenient to have structure, right, and simple structure, and his was dialectic, and so is mine. It's just different ingredients, and mine has this sort of invisible third ingredient, which is the repressed history of colonialism in this on Turtle Island. So there's always some sort of history lesson embedded in it. And I just think that, like I said about the nightmares, it's to me, a perfect little work of political art is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And, that trip that he goes on, that Scrooge goes on, is a nightmare to him, but one that wakes him up. And so I think that art can do that.
I had a thought, I was wondering how you thought of stewardship, just because I think that's something that comes up throughout the talk. D.S. Stewart's Spiral Jetty, and then you talk, or this last video that you show, where Andre is stewarding the land, but rather than building something, he's actually moving something. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, well, I think, we're now at a juncture where, like Smithson's paperback novel, Earthworks, we're at a cataclysmic moment in terms of environment and these issues. And I think people are looking for solutions in all kinds of places, including traditional ecological knowledge, tech from native people. And we're just interested in getting our land back so that we can take care of it in a better way. And so I'm very supportive of people like Andre who are doing the actual work, physical work of taking care of these sites and preserving culture and teaching the younger generations. And as he says, there's a sort of future that he's hopeful about, despite all this, as opposed to the closed-off sort of unidirectional, closed-off idea of entropy, which Smithson, I'm not sure if he even believed it, but it was a good explanation at the time, for a lot of things that he was doing.
Hi, do you think that Collect Pond has a future? And if it is, what it could be?
Well, it could, but it would take a radical, rethink, to put it mildly. It was spring-fed. The springs that once fed it are there. They're being used to cool the criminal courts building's air conditioning system, but they're there. And my original idea for it was actually to try to tap into that spring and just flood this little pocket park with a couple inches of water. Parks are sort of bowl-shaped so that they drain, or this one was. And it would have just been this occasional pond that would just go, rise and fall. But there were 40 homeless men, or 40 houseless people living underneath the eaves of the Civil Court building at the time. And they were afraid it would just become like a toilet or something. But those 40 blocks that I put down there, which I hired those guys to help me put down, it was like a ton of concrete, they weren't fixed to the deck at all. And they were never moved. And they were never graffitied, or they were never anything. And that was around the time, I think I installed them if I'm not mistaken, it was either it might have even been, no, I guess it wasn't 1989, but 1989 was the big controversy about Richard Serra's Tilted Arc. And that was right there, right near where I was. And, you know, I probably wouldn't have necessarily even thought of making it such a ground plane sort of thing without the land artist and without Smithson sort of. I mean, Smithson, that key project he did with TAMS for the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport really just flipped things, you know. Other things were flipping in art too. I mean, I forget who the critic was who talked about the, like on a printing press, the flatbed. Who was that?
What's his name? Leo Steinberg.
Yeah, the flatbed perspective.
Flatbed picture plane. Oh no, what are you talking about? The flatbed picture plane, or
flatbed picture plane?
That's Leo Steinberg.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, everybody gets that in art history, I guess, but it really is an interesting. I mean, this vertical orientation and the idea of you just have a discrete thing on the wall and it's mural basically, and then all this other space is somehow not being utilized. So it's amazing. It's just a terrible irony and a shame how he died. You know, surveying from an airplane for a site. So his aerial perspective actually killed him in the end. And oddly, my piece, I mean, this is just, I'm not mystical or anything, but my opening for the Cole show was on July 20th, which was the day that he was the anniversary, 51st anniversary of his death. So it's another weird connection.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.